Hey everyone, and welcome back to Gotcha Interact. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the possible new reaction. There's been some news about this going around, and if it's going to be a straight up new reaction just added to the game, or if it's just going to be something as part of something else like Imaginarium Theater. We're going to look into that today, and a couple of you actually have been asking, hey, can you guys talk about this? And that is the new possible Cryo and Dendro reaction or relationship. So it seems to look like some kind of Imaginarium Theater specific thing, only we don't really know as of right now if this is going to be something that's implemented into the general game overall, because that would definitely be a huge change, huge deal, be very cool if it was going to be added into the actual game. That could pose, some good pros, but that could also pose some cons that we could be talking about. But because this is only Imaginarium Theater, I think for the most part, at least right now, let's talk about that. So first off, we see that after enemies in the Imaginarium Theater with this Rhymegrass Blessing, Cryo, Dendro, Electro, that's what it's going to probably be, be the three elements for the Imaginarium Theater in question, Cryo, Dendro, and Electro. So for the Cryo Dendro here, after enemies take both Cryo and Dendro damage, they have to take both, they will take 45% increased Cryo and Dendro damage. And then a Frost Thorn appears, dealing Cryo and Dendro damage over time. And then once you go and upgrade the buff even further in the Imaginarium Theater, you realize you have a Path 1 and a Path 2. So Path 1, Vixen, what do we see there?
Well, in Path 1, it states that after enemies within Frostthorn take Electro damage, so once again, after you take the Dendro and Cryo damage, now if you put Electro on it, the Frostthorn will then convert that over to Electro DOT, and then decrease enemies' Electro resistance. So this could allow for some interesting kind of gameplay. You might already have some sort of like aggravate team or spread team kind of set up, and this might actually allow for more Electro damage to actually be increased here. If you take the second path, after that Frostthorn is hit, Cryo and Dendro, and you throw Electro on it, the Frostthorn will stop attacking, so that DOT will end, and enemies will take up to 135% increased Cryo, Dendro, Electro, and physical damage, and characters will have their Elemental Mastery increased by 300. So this actually allows for a lot more of, once again, of the same effect of Dendro and Electro. So there's definitely two different paths basically to go, so either just straight Electro damage to just get a bunch of Electro out, so maybe you're specifically following like an aggravate team, that first path would definitely be the first way to go. But if you kind of have like different teams that are both, DPSs that are of the both elements Cryo and Dendro, then this is probably, the second path actually might be better, especially with that EM buff. Now, it's nice that Physical and Cryo also still get a buff here, so you can still kind of get something interesting to happen there, especially with a physical damage increase, considering if you have Electro and Cryo in the same team, yes, you are going to be triggering that quicken reaction, but you're also going to be most likely going to be triggering that superconduct, which is already increasing physical damage, so now you're going to have an extra increase to in physical damage here, which could at least allow for some fun with those physical units.
Veressa is just around the corner, but arguably more exciting than even that are the upcoming characters Effie and Skirk. And what better way to help stock up those Primogem savings than to use Lootbar? Lootbar is an online platform that allows you to top up your Genshin Impact account at a cheaper rate than what's provided in-game. The best news about this is that only your UID and your server region are required when making a purchase. You don't have to use any emails, any passwords, or anything like that. Lootbar guarantees your delivery in just 30 minutes or less, but every time I've used it, I always get it within 60 seconds. If you do encounter any problems, they do have a 24/7 live chat support. You can see right here in the bottom right. If you're still unsure of whether or not Lootbar is safe or reliable, they have over 35,000 positive reviews that you can look at yourself on their own website, and also Trustpilot if you want to look in other sources. Don't take it from just us. There have been other creators that have used Lootbar in the past, such as Genshin Impact, Mujin, Tevat Times. Also, if you do play other games, you can check out their homepage and you can see here that they support Honkai Star Rail, Zenless Zone Zero, Wuthering Waves, and many more games. So what are you waiting for? Go ahead and check out that link in our description and our pinned comment to check out Lootbar for yourself and save some money on those top-ups.
So there's definitely a lot to talk about here. When we first got it, at least, a lot of people saw the picture. You guys have probably already seen it on the thumbnail. It basically looked like it was like half of a Cryo reaction split in half with a Dendro reaction. Now, we've always known that to be within the Imaginarium Theater like blessings. It has like the two reactions with kind of like a split down the middle. Now, the thing with that, though, is that that's what everybody saw. But usually if we see a reaction of some sort, there's usually like an X or something kind of like in between both elements.
It's a collaboration between the two.
Exactly. So that's what we saw with like Dendro when it came in with like Electro and Hydro and all that for Bloom. So we were kind of surprised that that kind of came into effect over here. So a lot of people thought it was going to be a brand new reaction. If they bring this out in the future, you know, we'll talk about teams and whatever that might actually be good and interesting with that. But for right now, this looks like it is only going to be specifically just the Imaginarium Theater. So if you guys were hoping for a new reaction, it's not going to be here. But I don't know. What do you think? I mean, I'm seeing a lot of the almost just throw together teams for this reaction. I don't necessarily see a crazy kind of combo. I mean, Electro, Dendro, and Cryo is a very interesting pull.
Yeah, I mean, well, definitely, like you said, in the context of Imaginarium Theater here, if it's going to be Cryo, Dendro, and Electro as your 3 elements, you know, I can see why they're, you know, trying to implement this, at least for Imaginarium Theater, so that's like, okay, what can we do to at least make it more interesting to use these 3 specific elements in the theater? And I think it's, you know, it's pretty fun and cool that they're doing that, because who knows, they could probably do that with something else that doesn't already have an in-game reaction with like the overworld and the abyss. What if we get a future theater that, you know, allows Dendro and Geo to have some kind of reaction or some kind of buff that you get out of using both of those? Because this isn't really like a reaction that's happening with Cryo and Dendro. It's not like you're triggering a new kind of, you know, thing. Like there's not a new word. They're not going to be giving it a new name. It's just, hey, if you use both elements, you know, after enemies take both Cryo and Dendro damage, oh, now they're just going to take more Cryo and Dendro damage. And then exactly. And then when you get to the path 1 and 2, you can kind of choose how you want that to buff even further. So it's not like straight up a new reaction. It's a new buff, essentially, that they're adding. Hey, if you do both of these types of damage, you know, here's a bonus for it. And I think that's going to be good for Imaginarium Theater specifically here, because if it's Cryo, Dendro, and Electro, thinking in the base terms of the game, because we know that Cryo doesn't react with Dendro and it only reacts with Electro, the only thing that comes to your mind when you think Cryo, Dendro, and Electro, if you're setting up Imaginarium Theater, is, well, Cryo's only going to react with Electro, and that automatically means it's going to be a physical team, because that's all Cryo's going to be doing in the case of those 3 elements. Otherwise, you're looking at primarily just Dendro related teams like Quicken, Aggravate. But honestly, with the path 2 increasing the Cryo, Dendro, Electro, and physical, I think it's going to make for some interesting physical teams in this Imaginarium Theater.
Oh, for sure.
When we get this, because you could definitely have a super conduct based team. Like think of your typical Eula team, but then have a 4th slot in there just be a Dendro character, just so you're getting this buff going to massively increase the physical damage of the team. Not to mention the Cryo damage as well, the Electro damage, the Dendro damage. It's all of the damage, so that's going to be really good. And then, hey, here's some elemental mastery too, even though a physical team doesn't really care about that. But, you know, hey, your Dendro reaction's going to like that a lot. So it's helping everything. So, and then kind of like on the contrary, if you're doing a Aggravate focused team, like let's say you're throwing in your Sino team and you're doing like a Sino, Kale, whatever, you know, Beto, and then your 4 slot, instead of just being another Dendro character, could just be like, heck, let's just say it's a Sit Lolly, because Sit Lolly, especially if the weapon, it's good buff, scroll, good shield, all of that. So in this context of theater, if you're, you know, you're going to deal Cryo and Dendro damage at some point, then everything's going to take more Cryo and Dendro damage. But then if you go to that path 2, or even the path 1, either way, you're increasing, well, in path 1, you're decreasing Electro resistance. That's really going to help Sino. But path 2 is going to increase everyone's damage, no matter who you have in there. So there's a lot of interesting things that can come out of this for thinking about what teams you're going to do in the Imaginarium Theater. The reason I think it's ultimately a good thing is because, and I guess I didn't realize this a lot at first, just because I have a very horizontally invested account, but when Imaginarium Theater dropped and became a new thing, and then we see all these new seasons for it with the new elements to use, if your account isn't very horizontally invested, okay, I need this character level 70, at least have this set going so they can just literally just be able to be thrown in the team, so I can actually like use all 20 or 22 characters or whatever. With something like this, that definitely helps some accounts that can barely even do Imaginarium Theater because they just don't have the sheer amount of the characters built up yet. This kind of implementation of a buff is going to help those very strange team comps, because even when you have a full account, you have like every single character and you're like Jello Impact, okay, you have every character built, there's still times where you're just forced with weird comps,
it's just a luck of
you
the
have
draw.
to just work with it.
It's
So a
gotcha
buff like this
game.
can kind of help that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think totally. It doesn't matter if you're vertically invested like Rift or if you're more horizontally invested like I am myself. Now, I don't have any issues with the Imaginarium Theater, and I have yet to have one, but I've been playing for 4 years. So if you've been playing for a less amount of time and you haven't really, and you're still playing more constellation focused and whatnot, totally fine to do. You may just be having some issues with the content in terms of the Imaginarium Theater, and like Rift was talking about, it's just probably because you have less characters, less of them built. So that's totally fair. And I think once again at the beginning of that state, like you said, no matter what, everybody kind of comes across a team where you're just kind of sitting there for the first first round or two, where if you don't get lucky with a good team, you're just kind of sitting there like, okay. But then you also have to realize, especially if you are more vertically invested, if you don't want to use up an Arlecchino early, you don't want to use up a C3 Raiden early, you don't want to use up a Nivelette or a Farina early, you don't want to use up any of those charges because you want to make sure that you can save them for your later game content, because that's the whole point. So once again, I totally agree. I think that these interesting fun little buffs, we've had teams that are just like, I'm just using this and I'm just throwing this extra character in there because unlike the Abyss, you can't run only 2 or 3 characters in a team. And sometimes if you're more vertically invested like myself, sometimes you only really need 2 or 3 characters, especially at that early round. If your DPSs are so strong, you don't really need the 4th character slot. And personally, I'd rather save those characters for later. So sometimes you're stuck with these weird team comps where you're just kind of using some weird, just random team thrown together. And so I think, like you're saying in the future, if we could get some really good, blessing differences between all these different characters. We have the Cryo, the Dendro, and the Electro kind of thrown together. We have some weird, crystallized with Cryo and Dendro or something in the future as well. Maybe if there's just kind of some weird buffs and blessings that can come out of this, maybe they're trying to test it out and see what everybody feels like. I think that's actually going to bring some kind of cool vibes to what we actually get here.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Maybe they're trying to just test out some things using Imaginarium Theater. Hey, we're thinking about trying to add a new reaction to the base game.
Maybe they're just trying to be like, okay, well, you can just throw in your Scoffier somewhere, your Scoffier, and then just have your other rest of your team already figured out, and then just throw her in there. And that's going to she still will help the other characters by doing personal damage. And at the same time with this blessing now actually have increased damage, and the other characters will have increased damage as well. At least a possible DOT that might be interesting and cool. So,
yeah.
I don't know.
So I kind of want to veer off to another somewhat of a side tangent. A different question is, okay, so this is going to be an Imaginarium Theater thing. It's not going to be a new reaction right now, right? So what if it was? What would be your opinion? I want to hear your opinion, Vixen, first on if we did get a Cryo Dendro relationship for the base game and got a new reaction out of that. What are some of the major pros and cons for you, at least?
Well, pros, obviously, I mean, when you add something new to the game, there's a pretty good amount of pros. I mean, you have the ability to use characters with other characters that you would have never thought to do before. So if they did this type of like DOT burn thing, where it's like burning, but basically like a Dendro and Cryo, you have this like wither effect type thing. So it's kind of like burning on an enemy. I think it would depend on the characters that you get from it, right? So initially, with burning doesn't do anything. But when you throw it in the context of somebody like Kanish, where a part of his kit and even his weapon can actually make good use of it and give himself buffs whenever it triggers, things like Overload, which were already part of the game, but don't do a lot of damage. As you call them, I think they're applicative reactions, not multiplicative reactions. Then there's, you're not really getting anything crazy there. So it's the same thing there with like Overload. We didn't really use Overload, and if anything, it was actually a negative because you knocked enemies around everywhere.
Yeah, the knockback, yeah.
Right. Until Shivers came out, and now it's probably some of the best things that you can do for an Electro or a Pyro character. And then if you look at, other things, I think, once again, you're going to have negatives to the point where you see, maybe, a Nahida kind of follows out of suit. If a lot of these new things kind of come in time, an EM boost isn't really going to do anything for that team. Because if you put EM... Right, if you put Nahida on a burn team, not to say that that's bad, that's actually very good, especially if you're doing like a burn melt. But if you do that, if you're putting it on a Kanish team, she's not really doing much.
Emily's just going to be better in the slot because it's more personal damage and you don't need the EM buff because it's not really doing anything for the burn reaction.
Exactly. Now she can do her own personal damage, and I believe the Pyro actually helps her, like Nahida's personal damage, but you're not helping Kanish, you're not helping anybody else, and you're just increasing a burn reaction. So it's the same thing with this Wither effect. Some of these characters might fall off and might have less usability. Talking about Emily could just fall right out of the scope of things because now we have this new thing that actually is better. If they have a character that comes out that does it better than what Emily does, because Emily doesn't really help buff, she just is personal damage. And, you know, Kanish could technically fall off if he doesn't work well with the Wither idea or whatever, if they threw this in.
Yeah, I guess what people would think about that is, well, just throw a pyro character in there so that you at least have burning happening
And Melt is
somewhat
kind of okay.
frequently, so that, you know, because that's all Emily needs is somewhat frequent burning to be happening for her artifact set, and just to kind of make sure that she's at her max potential.
Right.
'Cause that's really all, you know, Kanish and Emily are. They're just damage dealers with that restriction of, hey, I need burning to be happening at some point and somewhat frequently. If you did
Right.
like a burn melt thing, this is the con I would see with if they did add a Cryo Dendro relationship, a reaction to the game. What would that do to burn melt teams like burn melt Ganyu that you see? You know, you just add one Dendro character to Ganyu's melt team with like Bennett, Zhongli for your shielder, Nahida. That does really well. If Nahida reacts with Ganyu though, is that gonna mess up the consistency of burning? Because you've got another thing going on that could really just mess with the aura of the other elements for the other reactions, because you'll see that in things like, I've seen weird things like where in a Hyperbloom team sometimes, or more of a Burgeon team, sometimes people will use Overload to take off the Dendro to get a very specific order of application that they're looking for. You can look at Jeff's channel for stuff like that, because he really deep dives into stuff like that. But it just makes me wonder, you know, Wriothesley Melt, especially when you throw in a character like Nahida to cause burning so that Wriothesley can get even more melts. If we now have a relationship between Wriothesley and Nahida in that team, is that going to mess with the consistency of burning
Or will
for
it help?
Wriothesley's melt personal damage? Or will it help? Exactly. So, like,
Right.
you know, that's just something we'd have to kind of see and, you know, play around with, I guess. But overall, I think it's definitely interesting talk, because it would be interesting. Because then there's, like we've stated, there's other elements that they could do this with. You know, Geo doesn't react with Dendro. You know, and that would be kind of cool to see. Like, you have the earth and the plant kind of symbiotic relationship that you would think there'd be something there, but it'd be cool. So you never know. Or like Animo with Geo, Animo with Dendro. A lot of these
Right.
elements that are kind of like off on their own category. They don't react with each other, but they do react with the core four. So
Yeah, it would be interesting. I think there's definitely some. If I don't think they're ever gonna make any more reactions. That's just my personal feeling. We do have the new Nod Cry come out, and we did definitely get something releasing today already about it, or Nod Cry, however you want to say it. Something already has come out about that, which we might cover in a future video. But there's some already interesting things coming out about the next region. Maybe this is a test to see if people enjoy it. You know, I feel like the Imaginarium Theater is kind of like a playground, and I think people take it for granted to an extent. Just because, I mean, for me especially, I definitely do. And so it's stuff like this is actually going to make me enjoy those weird fun teams. So I don't have the same fun factor that Rift might have with just doing random teams together. But this is actually something that I'm actually kind of interested to see what might happen if the cards fall correctly for me for this type of thing to happen. So
Eula Hyperbloom's gonna go crazy.
quite literally. But like, that's the thing, right? Like Eula, usually with these physical teams, it's just very weird combo, so like they don't really do anything anyways, and the teams are just bleh, and bad. Like, it's just okay, that's great, that's
We're
fantastic.
just very basic, kind of bland.
Right. So what if you throw in a character that does a lot of off-field damage, like Fischl or Yaimiko, who you probably already use, and then you know, throw that in with a character like Emily, who already has a good personal amount of damage that she puts out. Or you put out a character like Nahida, or you put a character like Dendro Traveler or Kale, just a character you might not use a lot, maybe like those. Whatever it might be, you know, or Yao Yao as just a healer. You know, you have that reaction now going, and now you're just increasing, you know, Fischl and Eula's damage, which is just, I just think is really, really cool. I think it adds a lot more
Definitely
to what you
is.
can do. So. Anyways, that's everything we've got talking about this new quote-unquote reaction in the game. If you guys did like the video, please go ahead and like and subscribe. Check out other stuff on the content if you guys did like it. We also do have a Discord if you guys want to check that out as well. Thank you guys, though, for watching the video. Let us know what you guys think down below, and we'll see you guys in the next one.